now we're going to work the sleeves, and you have to decide whether you want to put the puff sleeve in or the cap sleeve. And in this video I'm showing you how to do the cap sleeve. When you do the puff sleeve, the order of events is slightly different, so you want to look at that video if you're not doing the cap sleeve. So for the cap sleeve, we are just going to work this as one layer, unless you're working with a silk like I've done here, which is so see-through that you definitely want to interline it. So I interlined it, and that gives it a bit more stability. And we'll turn in our hem, and then we want to make sure that the sleeve starts and ends at the same position on both sides, which is what we've marked when we marked our patterns, right? And we snipped it on. So you need to make sure of that. And then we're going to gather across the top, and the rule of thumb is that you want to have 2 centimeters to the front and 2 centimeters or 2.5 towards the back with your gathers. And of course also you want to check before you sew it all in that they are the same. And we're only going to sew the sleeve to the upper material, and then we're going to do that little trick where we're going to enclose the whole sleeve in the armholes, so it's all lovely and clean like this. And we're also going to understitch it all so that nothing rolls out, and it'll look really fantastic. Let's have a quick look at the pattern again. Right and left is basically the same, so if you forgot to mark it, no harm, no foul. So I am putting on my interlining here. Make sure that you put that to the underside of the fabric, and also cut it shorter. I cut the hem off, and that's my 2 centimeter hem. Cut a little bit more than that, so that's 0.8 inches. So I would do just under an inch or just over 2 centimeters, so that when you fold it over, you can get that line exactly in the 2 centimeter point for the hemline. I'm going to pin my interlining to the underside now so that it can't move anymore, and then we're going to put that hem in. And of course there is more than one option. You could overlock or serge the edge and then just simply turn it up and top stitch it, or you could turn it in 5mm and then turn it up 1.5 centimeters. I'm turning it up my 2 centimeters, and then I'm going to turn it in just under a centimeter. So that's up to you now. I put them next to each other because it generally makes it easier to see what you're doing, and you're not so likely to make any mistakes in that area. Now I'm turning it in, and I'm not going all the way to the fold, because it actually is a nicer, cleaner finish when you don't do that. So I'm not turning it in exactly 1 centimeter, I'm turning it in less. I think about 0.5 centimeter it was there, and then I turn it up. Now I'm going to top stitch it close to the edge, and when you're top stitching you should always use a longer stitch length. So I'm using 3 here, you can even go up to 3.5. At this point also, if you wanted to, you could put a little bit of elastic in there. I'm not doing it, it's not necessary, but it might be one of those things that would be nice to do. It's still a little bit crumply here, so I needed to go and give that a good press. Now we want to put the gather threads in as indicated on the pattern. We're starting fairly low down, it just makes it easier. And the first stitching line with the largest stitch available on your sewing machine should be about, you know, 1/2 foot away from the edge. And then we're going to add another stitching line, and that's got to be foot width from that first stitching line. And again, of course, we have the largest stitch available so that we can then pull the threads and create the gathers. Open out your armhole, and we're now going to put the sleeve on. I've marked the front and I've marked the sleeve head, but the only thing that's really important is the sleeve head, because that comes a little bit more further to the front. Place the sleeve head on the shoulder seam, And then we want to take the beginning of the sleeve and place it on where we have marked it with a little snip. That's where the sleeve starts, and I'm putting a pin vertical to the edge here. And then I'm also going to pull those threads so that my sleeve fits on. And the rule of thumb is always that you don't want them to go further than 2.5 centimeters, that's an inch, from that shoulder line. You might want to measure that, you know, for the smaller sizes, 2 centimeter is fine. And then as you go up, 2.5, rarely 3, maybe at age 12, but certainly not lower down. And now I'm doing the other side again. I'm moving the threads out of the way. I find my little snip, and that's where I place the end of my sleeve here towards the front. Pin vertical to the seam, and again I pull my threads until it fits on. Make sure that there is no little pleat or ruffle lower down than that 2.5 or 2 centimeters, because that always looks very, very unsightly. The other thing you'll notice is that the top line of your gather thread might not pull as much because obviously we have a curve. So you may want to pull that a little bit more. It will just make it a little bit easier to fit the sleeve on. Do take your time with this. People always think, oh yeah, when I put gathers in, it's easier to put the sleeve in. But it's also really important that you do it right. So take your time here. Pull it a little bit as well, and that makes sure that actually, you know, the gathers are pulled out to the point that they fit on perfect. And then I'm going to just put another pin on here, and we're ready to check that we've put it in okay, that it all looks good from the outside. So just roll it over, pull it a bit, and as you can see, they look very, very even. And you could also see how long I was taking to do this. I wasn't doing it really fast. Obviously, when I don't do it for the camera, it's a bit quicker. But to be fair, I do take my time with these things because I want it to look good. Grab your tape measure and then just check that you have it an inch to either side of the shoulder seam, which I do. And so that's brilliant. I now know I can sew these in. Right, moving over to the other side, I do exactly the same. And I'm giving you a little bit of a close-up here, just so you can see it. Move the threads out of the way. Place on your sleeve exactly where that snip is. Put in that vertical pin to hold it all in place. And then gather to make it fit. And also pull the top gather thread so it's nice and even. Pull it a little bit, let out what you don't need, move these over. Beautiful. Make sure that there are no gathers further down than what you want it to be. Round it into the sleeve. They have to sit absolutely pristine because everybody's going to look at it, and although you can put them in faster and all the rest of it, but it won't look as good. Take your time, line them up, make sure that the gathers are even Steven. And now make sure that you compare both sides so that you know that your gathers end in the same place on both the sleeves, and then we can sew them in. But this time we're not using the 1 centimeter seam allowance. What we're doing here is just foot width because it's effectively a holding stitch, and we don't want to go too far over so that the stitch becomes visible when we have put the lining on, and then we need to unpick it, which we don't want to do. So do this one foot width, and then when we put the sleeve in proper with the lining, then we do the 1 centimeter seam allowance. And make sure that the edges are on top of each other. You do that again quite slowly, moving around, checking that nothing underneath it has moved, that you don't have a pleat in there, that the seam is, you know, opened out and hasn't folded over. And here you can see me just making sure that my seam stays opened out and then I move that under as well. It's actually really, really simple, this method, when you stick to all those little steps. So here we are. I'm just making sure that I don't get any pleats in there. And that's it. Sleeve has been inserted. I do that on both sides. Make sure that you check that it's all okay. You can cut back the seam allowances as well. And if it is, we are now ready to add the lining to it. So just roll the lining over, the right side's facing, obviously. Start on the underarm and pin both layers together. In my case, of course, it's 3 layers because I've got the interlining. And then we're going to move up. I would suggest that you pin the shoulder seams together next first, so that you know where to go, and then it goes on edge to edge. And here you can see me put that pin back in that had come out, because it's really easy for that sleeve to get into the seam. So we want to make sure that doesn't happen. So keep that vertical pin in there when you pin all this. And in some places it won't lie completely flat and straight, and that's why it was good that we trimmed the edges off where it wasn't completely the same. So now when I put the rough edges on top of each other, I know that's going to be perfect. And I'll do the same, of course, on the other side as well. It looks a little bit bumpy here, but that's fine. You can get past that. So both sides are now pinned. So we pop on over to the sewing machine and we put those in. And this time we're using that centimeter seam allowance. Don't force your fabric round too early, right? Like this. You want to like keep feeding it in straight as you come round the curve. And make sure you stick to that 1 centimeter now, so that we cover that first initial stitching line. You can prevent the lining from pleating over if you use a little pin for that. Here it's a little bit bumpy, so I need to move it apart as I go. It takes time, but it's actually not difficult to do. Just, you know, don't rush this, because everyone sees this. This is like so obvious if it's wrong. There we go. Come to the end and we do the same on the other side, obviously. So both of them are in. Very important now is that you take out the pins that you left in there before we turn anything through, because when we turn it through and there's a pin left in there, it can scratch the fabric or it can pull threads and ruin the whole piece. So you really don't want to do that. So remove your pins and then cut back the seam allowance. What I'm not doing here is snipping it as well. It is really not necessary if you cut it back. Do the same on the other side, both sides obviously. And now I can pull it through. So I put a safety pin on the end of the lining and interlining, and I push that through the shoulder seam. And then all I have to do is pick it up on the other side in here, and then I can pull it. Because my shoulder is not that slim, this is absolutely possible. It always depends how slim a shoulder is. If you're using this technique for another pattern, it might be harder to pull through, but generally speaking, if it's not smaller than 3 centimeters, there should be no problem pulling the back through a shoulder, whichever pattern you use from other designers as well. It's a really great method. Now we can take that safety pin off and move out our underarm, and that's just perfect, isn't it? It's just lovely. Such a simple method. Have a good check there. Yep, all good. Now we want to remove our gather stitches, so I'm just putting a pin there and lift it out in one point. I'm using the head of the pin for that, and pull on the thread, and then on the other side it will just lift away. And that's it, job done. Now the other thing we want to do is to understitch the arms so that the lining can't roll out, and that means that we're sewing the seam allowance to the lining from this point down here all the way up to where the sleeve begins. Just make sure that your seam allowance faces the lining. Pop over to your sewing machine, and with stitch length 2.5 you can stitch this down. And there we go, all the way up to where the sleeve starts. You don't need to go any further at all. It's just meant to prevent the rolling out of the lining in that particular area. And we are finally at the point where we can press all this. So lift out the underarm, beautiful. And then with lots of heat and steam, we're going to give this a jolly good press. If you're doing the shoulder area, you can move it over the edge of your ironing board so you don't accidentally iron pleats into anything else that you don't want to iron. And there you go, beautiful result. I'm just going to give it a little bit of a press here on the other side as well. And that's it, all done. I hope that you enjoyed this particular video, because I think it's a really good technique to learn, especially if you're a beginner. It's all looking great. And our next step now will be to close the side seams, and I see you there.